Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is the highest rated game on Metacritic, and ever since its release in 1998 has as of yet an unbeatable score of 99. Though, to be quite honest, it's easy to hold the highest rating on Metacritic when it's based only on 22 reviews, most of which are as eloquent as a 6-year-old excitedly explaining why they love the game so much. And I quote here: "For instance, when a bat is about to get you, the tune comes on, doom doo 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 doo." 11 out of 10. Granted, the card is 32 MB in size, but hey, there is a lot of audio, video, characters, environments and effects at work in this puppy that make CDs seem obsolete as a gaming medium. There are reviews that in their rundown say things that are quite frankly not true, like how the game has complete 7 different dungeons. There's 9 full dungeons in Ocarina of Time and 3 mini dungeons, though maybe the reviewer has completed 7? Not sure. And of course, how can one not love a game where you collect many different items for your inventory? Amazing. The main area of the game is known as Hyrule Field. Like any field, Hyrule Field is big. 1998 online reviews are priceless. By the way, this same review has a section for gameplay, and most of it is explaining the story and barely talks about the gameplay. At the end of every dungeon lies a boss creature that is simply breathtaking. You'll need new underwear after meeting some of them. In all, the dungeons more than satisfy any gamer's needs. The needs to get new underwear, I guess. But the best review is definitely this one. 100 on Metacritic. No link, but thanks to the Internet Archive, I found the rest of the review, and it turns out that the Metacritic blurb is literally half of it. This is the review in its entirety. I mean, come on. I'm not trying to say that Ocarina of Time isn't a classic. You've seen the thumbnail, you know it's great. And on a personal level, it is definitely one of my favorite games of all time that I would heartily recommend to anyone. But we can't deny that its spot at the top of the Metacritic chain is solely thanks to quite poorly written reviews that fail to explain what actually makes the game so great. Many of them don't even mention the Z-targeting, or L-targeting as it's called in the 3DS version. In other words, the target lock-on, which is Ocarina of Time's biggest contribution to game design. It's not the first game ever that has implemented a lock-on system, but it is the first that popularized it. The concept was still so relatively fresh that developers felt the need to explain it through narrative and frame the mechanic as your fairy companion helping you out. It's what has made the transition from a 2D Zelda game to 3D one work. Speaking of 2D Zeldas, if you haven't watched my reviews of A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening, I would highly advise you to do so. This video is definitely watchable standalone, but those 2 games will be referenced a number of times, so knowing my analysis can provide better context to everything I will say in the review. Links are in the description and YouTube cards. Now, when it comes to Ocarina of Time in particular, due to the lack of Nintendo 64 footage, you probably have guessed that we will be taking a look at the 2011 3DS remaster. So far, this is the definitive way to play the game. It's exactly the same as the original Ocarina of Time, but with a bunch of quality of life improvements, some of which were really necessary. And let's not point fingers at the water temple, though we all know that's one of the implications. My name is Stanislav Costiuc, I am a game designer, and this is my review of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which as always will be done with the help of my Stasocritic system, starting with the first category, design. This is the most important part of Stasocritic. The way a game is played, built and structured is key to its quality and our enjoyment, so the category has the biggest weight for all scores, 4. Ocarina of Time doesn't try to reinvent the wheel when it comes to the direction of the Zelda franchise. It takes A Link to the Past as a template, mixes it with some inspirations from Link's Awakening, but tries to implement everything in such a way that would make perfect sense for a 3D environment. That said, Ocarina of Time has clear signs of a game that went through a very lengthy process of developers trying to figure out what would make perfect sense in the first place. Because the best way to summarize the design of the game is that it's inconsistent. Like the previous Zelda games, Ocarina of Time's gameplay focuses more on what items you have and how you can use them rather than character-based core systems. But what you can actually do with these items doesn't feel as versatile and consistent as it does in A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening. It starts with the little things. In the game you'll play as Child Link and Adult Link in 2 different time periods, and most of the equipment is available only to one but not the other. As such, one item that Child Link has is a boomerang. It can be used to hit switches, stun enemies, and bring objects back to you, including the gold Skulltula tokens and heart pieces. Adult Link has a hookshot, which not only is used to bring yourself over across chasms and such, but also has the same purposes as the boomerang: hitting switches, stunning enemies, bringing gold Skulltula tokens, but it's not working on heart pieces. In a similar vein, you can't use the hookshot to hit ice switches, even though considering that both the slingshot that fires blunt Deku Seeds and bow that fires sharp arrows work, you'd think that a pointing thing on a chain that you have to aim with would work as well, considering that you can activate crystal switches with it. This feels very arbitrary, especially in comparison with how fire is handled in the game. Torches and enemies vulnerable to flames are affected by any source of fire, be it from a flaming Deku Stick, fire arrows, or the Dean's fire spell. For example, you can use that spell to skip whole puzzles, like the one where you need to fire an arrow through a torch to thaw an ice cube while standing on a moving platform, or where you need to place enemies in a certain position so you could burn them after pressing a button. But thanks to the fire elements working logically, you can deduce alternative ways to proceed, and that's great. There are other interesting interactions, like the keys transforming into fire keys should they fly through a torch. But then again, even with fire, there is a little inconsistency, but it's very localized. The fire breath of Dodongos doesn't light up torches, even though when baby Dodongos explode, the walls still crumble as if they'd been hit by a bomb, so expectations are similar. But this in particular is a very minor omission. Though if we get back to the topic of expectations, that is a matter of items simply not meeting them. The Megadon Hammer is used to break boulders in the overworld that even bombs can't destroy. So when you encounter Freezards, the ice statue enemies, you'd think that this hammer would make quick work of them, but it's actually no better than your sword. There is a boss battle focusing on twin witches, one representing the fire element and another the ice one. They're defeated by sending back the opposite element at them using the dungeon's key item, the Mirror Shield. However, there are 2 optional magic arrow types that you can get: fire arrows and ice arrows. You'd think that, hey, maybe you can use ice arrows against the fire witch and vice versa? Well, no, they just block those arrows, forcing you to defeat the boss with the Mirror Shield only. This particular example also feeds back into the aspect of Ocarina of Time doubling down on the principle of dungeon bosses requiring the dungeon's key item to defeat them. Ironically, one of the game's best boss fights, Bongo Bongo, is an exception to this rule. You don't need the Shadow Temple's hover boots, but rather the Lens of Truth and bow you find in other places. While some other better fights like the Phantom Ganon one have stages that for the purposes of variety don't require you to use the dungeon's treasure. But sadly, too many boss fights in Ocarina of Time are beaten solely with the help of the dungeon's key items, which eventually makes a lot of the fights feel predictable. Getting back to ice arrows though, they seem useless in general. Again, you'd think that they would make quick work of lava-based enemies, but they just freeze them like any other enemy and aren't any more effective than other types of arrows or weapons. The Shard of Agony item is supposed to blink on screen whenever there is a secret nearby, but it actually works just in places that hide holes in the ground in the overworld, not all secrets. For example, in the entire game there is a single bombable wall with 0 visual markers. The only way to distinguish it from the rest is if you hit with your sword and hear a different sound. At least I found only one wall like that and couldn't find information about any others. And Shard of Agony doesn't work in it, even though it is clearly a secret. And most of the hidden grottos that Shard of Agony does show are opened up by using bombs. But some require you to play the Son of Storms? To call rain? To open up a hole? How does that make sense? This isn't hinted by anybody, not even the Gossip Stones to speak with which you need a Mask of Truth. And speaking of Song of Storms, there's an empty oasis in the desert, and it is pretty straightforward to deduce that maybe you can fill it with water using that song. But it doesn't work if you play the song near the oasis. You have to stand on the specific rock next to it for the song to work. Any of these particular points isn't a big problem on their own, but there's a lot of them, and when taken together they showcase a lack of item versatility and consistency in comparison to what you'd find in A Link to the Past or Link's Awakening. It's not as interesting to figure out how to deal with enemies or solve problems, because Ocarina of Time either doesn't let you be creative or doesn't provide the possibility to be so, which, again, wouldn't have been a problem in isolation. It's fine for some games to be more streamlined, but here's the thing, sometimes the game does let your creativity run free, and that's what makes it feel especially inconsistent. It's fun figuring out that you can flip over some enemies with the hammer, or stun opponents with the Deku Nuts so you'd go into offensive instead of staying on the defensive, but the game keeps funneling you into using a limited amount of tools. Something similar happens with the way Ocarina of Time handles exploration and its structure. Now, on the surface, it seems like the game takes cues from A Link to the Past rather than Link's Awakening. From the get-go you have access not only to Kokiri Forest, but also the Lost Woods. After you complete the first dungeon, a huge area opens up to you, with some quests or inventory items you receive later unlocking the rest of the world bit by bit. And even though when you try to go exploring there's an owl suggesting you to turn around towards your main objective, he doesn't actively block you. That's good, right? Well, not really, because that freedom is but an illusion, as most of the time you're barely able to do anything without following the story. So what if you can visit Lon Lon Ranch before Hyrule Castle if the characters that you need for side quests are not actually there until you complete the castle section? Which, by the way, is sort of annoying flow-wise, as most likely you'll have to wait a whole night for the egg to hatch to wake up a blocking Mario lookalike. Which in itself is a symptom of another problem that Ocarina of Time has, not knowing how to handle novelty. The game has added a day-night cycle, which already is a pretty atmospheric thing that makes the world feel more real. But then Ocarina of Time also wanted this mechanic to matter for gameplay, and here it couldn't really find a way how. As such, time of day changes only when you're in the overworld and is static in all other locations, and its influence ultimately is limited. Depending on if it's night or day, some shops are open or closed, the gold sculptural collectibles appear outside only at night, and some tasks like the aforementioned egg hatching require you to wait until morning. Ocarina of Time has integrated a whole mask system, but in the end it's used pretty much only for a trading quest, where you have to find a person interested in the mask you're wearing. There are some interesting interactions with NPCs when you're wearing particular masks, but that's about it. Again, the game didn't quite figure out what to do with this novelty, and the act of trading masks isn't quite enjoyable. There is a mechanic of firing arrows while riding on a horse, but it's really not useful beyond a minigame focused on that, and getting a special collectible found only if you ride around Hyrule Field on a horse. This collectible requires you to shoot at big posts that appear in specific spots for a very limited time. It's somewhat annoying. Even the game's central concepts, time travel and the titular ocarina, are not exempt from this sadly existing pattern. The aspect of time travel is severely underutilized. In the main quest, besides the initial mandatory forward travel, you have to tackle the timey-wimey ball only 2 times. Once when you learn a song in the future to go back and use it in the past, after which you have to complete a quite horrible mini-dungeon that can be finished in 5 minutes when you know what needs to be done, but is very frustrating when you don't, and the second time when you need to complete part of the Spirit Temple as Child Link before getting back there as Adult Link. And during side quests you literally needed only 4 beans. In the past you can find some dirt spots. If you plant special beans there, then in the future they will grow as levitating leaves that can be used to find heart pieces and treasures. And that is if we don't mention the fact that outside of a couple locations, the world differences between future and past are relatively few, even though the future is supposed to represent Ganon's tyrannic rule. In a certain way, the lack of time travel elements is a blessing in disguise. You can switch between past and future only in a single location, the Temple of Time, and while there is an Ocarina song that lets you travel directly to the temple, overall it is a pretty cumbersome flow regardless. And speaking of Ocarina songs, there's 12 of them in total, well 13 including the secret Scarecrow song. Half of these songs though are for fast travel into different dungeons, as such you're unlikely to use them often. Other songs are very situational. Saria's song should be used only a couple of times in the entire game. Song of Time, despite its moniker, is used mostly to move specific blocks. The song that you'll use the most is Zelda's Lullaby. It's a one-fits-all solution to most song-related problems. Need to call a fairy? Zelda's Lullaby. Need to uncover a secret passage? Zelda's Lullaby. Need to change the water level? Zelda's Lullaby. Link's Awakening also had an ocarina and its uses were much more limited than here, but that also wasn't the most front-facing mechanic of that game. But Ocarina of Time places high cohesive importance to the instrument, hence the name, and the game's design fails to represent that importance. These failed attempts to make novel concepts truly matter lead to a bunch of weird flow issues. After leaving Kokiri Forest, you will need to get back there to learn Saria's song, but that is actually impossible to do until after a particular trigger in the story. Saria won't sit on the stump she has to be on even if you already have the ocarina, which renders potential exploration useless should we connect this to previous statements. Then, to get into the third dungeon, you need to access Zora's Fountain, and to do that you need to find a bottle with a message in Lake Hylia, and you won't even know that you need to search in the lake unless you happen to talk to one of the Zoras, who is invisible until they pop out of water when you're close enough. And by the way, if that happens to be the first Zora you meet, there will be a different text, so you'll have to talk again to hear the hint. But all that doesn't matter, because unless you go to Gerudo Valley on the opposite side of the world, there is no way to access the lake without a silver scale, and to get the silver scale you need enough rupees to participate in a diving minigame. Phew. And while technically hints for all this exist within the game itself, all I'm saying is I understand why the 3DS version has added the Sheikah stones that show you videos about what to do next in case you're tired of stumbling about. It's worth pointing out that similar sequences that are sort of annoying in Ocarina of Time were present in A Link to the Past as well, but there they were fine. The difference is that A Link to the Past has a much more compact scale of the world, with the character having a pretty fast movement speed in relation to it, so faffing around while you talk to people to understand what to do next didn't feel cumbersome, there was very little friction. Ocarina of Time, on the other hand, is relatively realistic with its proportions, meaning that the simple act of running around the environments takes longer, and therefore the same design decisions regarding progression and how to provide related hints do not work as well just because you spend more time in a state where you don't have a clear indication of what needs to be done to proceed. Though of course there are also some very smart choices related to Ocarina of Time's handling of its world scale. You won't have the possibility to fast travel until you become Adult Link, which will happen quite far into the game. There are two things that Ocarina of Time does so that traveling big distances as Child Link wouldn't become a chore. First, it limits the story of that section mostly to the eastern part of Hyrule, meaning that you're not forced to traverse the entirety of Hyrule field by foot, which thanks to reviews we already know is big like any field out there. But also there are a number of shortcuts between different locations. This helps greatly considering that regardless of where you have saved the game, as Child Link you always start in your home in Kokiri Forest. But still, there is a weird omission. There are no shortcuts towards Hyrule Castle, so whenever you want to go to that location you have to actually run through the big Hyrule field, or use rolls and side jumps because it will be faster that way. Another weird flow issue is that the very first time you have to get to Hyrule Castle, unless you use those tricks, there is no way to reach the city before night falls and gates close. So your first experience with this area is most likely going to be seeing the gates close in your face and having to fend off stall children until night passes. Of course, if you know the Sun Song, you can play it on your ocarina for the night to turn into day, but there is no way for you to learn it by that point. If Link's Awakening had a flow problem of constantly blocking you from exploration without certain items, even though you wouldn't necessarily need those items after unblocking the area, then the problem with Ocarina of Time is sort of the opposite. It doesn't block you from exploration, but there's barely anything you can do without getting a number of items, so why bother? Between these games, the golden standard is A Link to the Past, where after the world opens up, you can gain a bunch of heart pieces and inventory items, even without progressing the story towards the next step, so exploration feels meaningful from the get-go. And if we take a look at the overall dungeon progression, technically, in Ocarina of Time, it's this, which is very similar in nature to A Link to the Past. But it feels like this. The reason being that the game doesn't really adapt its narrative or dialogue to the order you're completing the dungeons in. So even though you can visit Fire Temple before Forest Temple, when you have the dialogue with Sheik at the entrance, it feels like you should have listened and went to the Forest Temple first. And that's considering that the Fire Temple is clearly designed to be completed without the bow from the Forest Temple. There is only a single door that is open with it, and the room behind it holds the dungeon map, which you can still get without a bow by climbing over a fence in another chamber. And speaking of inconsistencies, it feels weird that when you can do stuff like that, it turns out you can't jump over some railings in another dungeon for the purposes of saving time from going down the stairs the long way around. It might feel like I'm nitpicking because I list a lot of issues that are either small or not that big on their own. Most of them I would probably even ignore in a typical situation, but there is just so many caveats. They really do pile up, the list is far from over. And it's a shame because Ocarina of Time is also full of absolutely fantastic design. For example, Kokiri Forest is an amazing little playground that lets you get the hang of the core mechanics. You're not allowed to progress until you have a sword and shield, which of course is fine for a tutorial section. Sword you have to find and shield you have to buy. So naturally you will just go around, jump over stuff, cut grass, talk to people, everything with the purpose of getting accustomed enough with the controls before getting to the first challenge. But even then, the requirements to progress is to find a small hidden hole, and that's a bit weird. After the introductory segment, you get to the inside of the Deku Tree dungeon, and it's just a wonderful tutorial dungeon. There are so many great things about the way it teaches players different mechanics and how to navigate these environments. For example, to get from the ground area to floor 2, you need to climb up. The game understands that you might not yet know that vines are a climbable surface and you wouldn't be drawn towards them, so it also places a ladder for a clear visual language. And the second floor has a narrow pathway, so you get close enough to the next set of vines for your fairy Navi to give a hint about them. Though you won't be able to climb them yet because of the Skulltulas hanging around, so you go further, learn how to open a door, and encounter an enemy that is specifically designed to teach you how to defend yourself. You get to the next room and literally are not allowed to leave until you learn how to use the slingshot that you find there on the only possible element it could be used on, the ladder in the webbing. This new weapon allows you to deal with the Skulltulas on the vines and therefore climb higher. There is a heart in the air, and since the game has never given any reason not to trust it, you are likely to jump over to get it. The jump from such height will give you enough force to break the webbing that was on the floor near the entrance. And by the way, I can't help but mention that this is the only time you will encounter a puzzle of such physics-based nature in the entire game. Definitely puts the inclusion of this part under question, especially considering that after you break the web on the first floor, the game has a specific moment teaching you that fire is actually how you have to deal with webs, and that will be the method used across the rest of the game. But this doesn't change the fact that inside of the Deku Tree is a great learning experience. It uses a combination of direct tutorials through Navi and implicit tutorials through environments, while showing you all the inner workings of a dungeon. Well, almost all. Childlink dungeons don't have any keys at all, those will be introduced later. The purpose of channeling dungeons is to teach their different principles. Inside of the Deku Tree introduces the overall concept and how you have to progress through them. The Dongus Cavern teaches the concepts of a central chamber and a core dungeon puzzle. From the get-go you see the skull, the mouth of which you have to open with bombs, and to do that you need to progress through the dungeon that is linear, but will make you go through the same central chamber a number of times, both on first and second floors, to teach about this verticality. And then, inside Jabu Jabu's belly, actually introduces some non-linearity and asks you to use that verticality to solve the dungeon. It is the first one that really asks you to think about the environments as three-dimensional spaces, and the only way to solve the conundrums you face would be to understand how different rooms on different floors are interconnected. And yeah, the act of having to carry Princess Ruto around can be a bit annoying, but that's essentially a gating mechanism. By leading her to correct rooms to get from the floor below to the floor above, you prove that you understand how dungeon spaces work. This set of 3 tutorial dungeons is absolutely fantastic. They're not that great if you take a look at them through a lens of how a full proper dungeon should work. They're pretty linear, with very little and basic exploration possibilities, and only one particular thing that you can or should do at any given time, but they're really exemplary in terms of being spaces that teach you what dungeons are and how to solve them. And after all, that's their goal. It's a shame that with such great introductory dungeons, Ocarina of Time consistently fails to build upon them. Let's take the Forest Temple for example, an amazingly atmospheric dungeon no doubt. When you enter its central chamber, you see 4 posts stealing 4 flames and disappearing. Now, with this chamber having doors that lead to a number of different directions, one would expect that these posts are located across different parts of the dungeon, and every time you get back you would see your progress. Except the dungeon is not built like that. Well, yes, if you get back to the central chamber you will see the torches light up to show the progress, but it's not built with that in mind. The dungeon is essentially divided into 2 parts. This open area that's first available to you, and this linear part that is consistently gated by locked doors that require small keys. This, for all intents and purposes, linear corridor is the meat of the dungeon. 3 out of 4 posts are found there, with the last one appearing in the central chamber after you deal with the others. The local gimmick of firing at a switch to twist or untwist corridors, which by the way is very cool, is also limited only to this part of the dungeon, and with the exception of the boss door, all locked doors are located in this section as well. What's not great about the setup is that the enjoyment of it really depends on what type of player you are. If you're like me, who likes to explore absolutely every place possible in a dungeon before unlocking a single door, you will have a pretty smooth progression that involves tackling these 2 dungeon segments consecutively, as 3 of the small keys are located here. If, however, after getting a small key you just can't wait to see what's behind the locked door, well, prepare for a lot of backtracking, as what will happen is you open the door, eventually reach another locked door, go all the way back to the central chamber, search for the key, go back the same way to open the next door, progress a bit, reach another locked door, go all the way back to the first area, get the 3rd key, and then get through the linear corridor again. You get the point. And the problem is really that there are no unlockable shortcuts that would lead to different parts of the corridor. For example, if you happen to accidentally fall down somewhere in this area, to get back up you have to retrace absolutely all your steps. Now, to be fair, there is an optional Farore's Wind spell which allows you to create warp points wherever you want in the dungeon, and that can certainly help, but due to it not being a mandatory to learn spell, the point still stands. So in the end, Forest Temple is a dungeon that has a lot of very nice standalone challenges, and again the part where you have to twist a corridor to change a room's rotation is just brilliant, but structurally is very rigid. With that in mind, I find the Fire Temple to be a far better dungeon. For the most part, it also is a fairly linear set of standalone challenges with some branches towards optional items, but because it is structured differently, essentially you always get keys in the newly opened up areas, so you never have a situation where you have to keep backtracking to get more keys, it flows much better. This temple also has a couple of nice situations regarding dungeon recontextualization, something that was greatly present in Link's Awakening, but mostly absent here. After you get the Megaton Hammer, you can access some places you couldn't before, and there is a Flare Dancer mini-boss that you encounter twice. However, the first time you have to fight them without the hammer and it's fairly challenging. But the second time you fight this enemy after finding the hammer, and using it transforms the battle into a much simpler affair, which is a great way to show how powerful this new tool is. Which is exactly the reason why it should also deal with freezards quickly, but I digress. Shadow Temple is exceptionally linear and honestly there is not much to discuss, and Spirit Temple is my most favorite temple conceptually. It is the only one which you have to visit 2 times, once as Child Link and once as Adult Link. However, what is very disappointing is that instead of both Links having to travel through same spaces but with different contexts because they have access to different tools, what actually happens is that one half of the dungeon is for Child Link and the other one is for Adult Link, with a big chamber at one point sort of connecting the two halves. I say sort of because the left half of this chamber is for Child Link and the right one is for Adult Link, so there is no interconnection either. However, what I love about this temple personally is that it has several fire-based challenges, and thanks to the versatility of the fire element, there are several ways you can solve them, which is great. The very last dungeon of the game, Ganon's Castle, is one of those cases where the design is used to create emotions rather than elaborate, interesting environments. At the end of every Adult Link dungeon, one character is awakened as a sage. Ganon's Castle is a collection of smaller linear chambers. At the end of every one, each sage fulfills their destiny to help trap Ganon forever. The sequence is followed by a straightforward climb to the top of the castle. Again, this straightforwardness really works from an emotional standpoint, as the tension of meeting the final boss of the entire game gets higher. If you have played the game, you might have noticed that I skipped one temple, and that's because I really saved the best for last. The Water Temple. It is mimetic in a way. Everyone talks about how confusing and awful this temple can be. And it can, in the Nintendo 64 version. But the 3DS version makes 2 very important quality of life improvements. The first one is that the iron boots have transformed into an item that you can easily put on and off with the press of a button, as opposed to keep meddling with the gear menu, which saves a lot of time. And the second is that it is very clear where you need to go to switch to a particular water level, thanks to lines leading to the respective rooms and signs showing what the level will actually be. It really helps in making conscious choices regarding where to go. Actually, there is a third really subtle but important difference. After changing the water level to a particular state, a hidden hole is opened, and the 3DS version, unlike the original, really focuses on that fact so you wouldn't miss it. These quality of life changes really help to see the Water Temple for what it really is, and that is the perfect dungeon. But before we delve deep into it, let's quickly go back to the Dodongo's Cavern and Jabu Jabu's Belly. We have talked about how the purpose of the Dodongo's Cavern is to teach about the concept of a central dungeon puzzle, and the purpose of Jabu Jabu's Belly is to make you think of dungeons as 3-dimensional interconnected spaces. Here's the thing though, and ultimately why both Forest and Fire temples which precede the Water Temple fail holistically. They don't expand upon those notions. They have hints of that, but ultimately everything is limited to certain smaller sections, like the rotating rooms in the Forest Temple. The biggest problem with the Water Temple largely stems from the fact that Ocarina of Time doesn't prepare you for it with its pretty linear sectioned off Adult Link dungeons. Of course, a challenge where you have to properly understand and manipulate the whole temple space itself would prove to be a big difficulty spike. But at its core, it is a logical continuation of principles that were introduced to you in the Child Link dungeons. There is a central chamber that you have to keep coming back to, and the chamber itself is a puzzle, as depending on whether the water level is low, medium or high, you have access to different rooms of the dungeon. This may seem like a lot to take into account, but here's the thing, the game really makes sure that you take in this dungeon segment by segment. This is the area that's available for you from the start, and you can see that it's really small. And then after you drop the water level for the first time, you're limited only to the bottom part of the temple until you find a key, which will let you into the room where you need to raise the water level. Your exploration possibilities change, but are still confined to certain rooms. And so you will keep opening up the temple bit by bit until you unlock the whole dungeon. The Water Temple tries really hard to make sure players understand the way its three-dimensional spaces work, as that is mandatory to complete some of the puzzles. The problem is that some gameplay flaws can still mess things up, even with the big quality of life improvements the 3DS remake introduces. For example, there is a situation where while going up the water you need to notice a cracked wall, so you would make a connection to get back there later once you change the water level and could access the crack. The problem is that you need to make sure the camera looks in a specific spot, and with the only way to rotate it being the recenter function, that's quite cumbersome. So depending on your initial camera position, you might miss the clue, so even some of the best Ocarina of Time content can't fully properly showcase its potential because of a number of flaws. Based on everything we have discussed, that really sounds like Ocarina of Time in a nutshell, doesn't it? And with that, I feel like I'm running out of design points to tackle. Not because there's nothing else left, but because I will start going in circles should I continue. The trading side quest provides a great reward, but is pretty boring to complete as most of the time you'll have to go between the same locations over and over again. Gold sculptures are a really good collectible in principle, but in practice it's quite annoying since most of them come out only at night and a bunch have obscure conditions to appear. Ocarina of Time doesn't have stealth mechanics, and yet there are stealth sections. There is a reasonably designed one when you need to get past the guards in Hyrule Castle to see Princess Zelda, but then there is the Gerudo Fortress that's just very annoying even with the ability to stun guards. Even the game's biggest revolution, Z-targeting, has inconsistent range and can act very weirdly at times. Ocarina of Time is a game of contradictions, in a way. For every fantastic piece of design, there is a whole package of problems, sometimes negligible and other times pretty big and annoying, alongside underwhelming implementation of certain aspects. Some of them are pretty forgivable thanks to the fact that they enhance the atmosphere. Hyrule Field is very empty and has barely anything to do in it, but while it certainly feels big, it is actually quite compact and can be traversed relatively fast even on foot, and really fast with your horse Epona. And by the way, to learn Epona's song you have to talk to Malon 3 times. She is one of the few characters in the game that changes her dialogue on repeat interactions, so it's not something you would expect. Regardless, Hyrule Field works perfectly well as a hub between locations, and seeing all the different landmarks in the distance enhances the feeling of the world being large and connected, despite it consisting of different level segments. The mask selling side quest feels like padding, and honestly it is, but trying to complete it does lead to interesting interactions, and the final reward can lead you to learning some curious lore. You get the idea. Even the Gold Sculpture collectible quest, for all its flaws like a bunch of very obscure spiders to find or having to keep playing the sun songs as during your search the day keeps dawning, just feels atmospheric due to the sound these spiders make and the fact that they prefer dark places. The battle with Dark Link is really not great in terms of design. It's a mirror battle in which you have to find what mechanics you can abuse. Not great from that perspective, but the setup, the room you fight in, how you have a reflection that disappears halfway through the chamber, all this is incredibly atmospheric. This is the real strength of the game. At the end of the day, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is a collection of 9 great dungeons, and in between these great dungeons there is a lot of content that's underwhelming one way or another. I can barely list anything without caveats, from the fairly weak Gerudo Training Grounds optional dungeon, to boring big bow hunting, to a lot of hard pieces that are found exactly the same way, by planting a bean in the past and using the leaf that grows from it in the future. And that is if we don't mention the overall inconsistencies in the way item gameplay is designed, the structure of the world that doesn't reward exploration until you reach particular story points, a lot of obtuse actions you have to do to understand how to proceed next, and the fact that the 2 central motifs are severely underused in gameplay. All of this is why, should you open up all the scores for design, I will assign a 7 to Ocarina of Time. I will be honest, I originally wanted to assign an 8 just based on the feelings I had from playing the game, but while writing the script I realized that this couldn't be the case. Ocarina of Time does a lot of things right, and I suppose it makes sense. It has all the learnings from A Link to the Past to lean on. It has adapted the Zelda gameplay to the 3D environment real well too, and overall is thoroughly enjoyable. But it really struggles to find an identity, struggles to take advantage of its innovations, and struggles to make everything flow naturally. On the other hand, it is very atmospheric, and that not only helps to smoothen the experience, but also is imperative for the game's success, the exact reasons for which we'll discuss later in the video. Let's move on to context. This category has the weight of 1 because it's about things that enhance the experience rather than define it: plot, motivation, character arcs, etc. This is the first time this series starts to dabble in long-term continuity. While in the future this would certainly become more confusing and at times questionable with all the different timelines and reincarnations and whatnot, at the time of this game's release all that didn't exist yet. Ocarina of Time positioned itself as a prequel to A Link to the Past, telling the details of a story we have heard in that game's prologue of 7 sages sealing a thief in the Sacred Realm. Again, nowadays this might have already been retconned to oblivion, but at the time this was the implication. Despite Ocarina of Time being a prequel to A Link to the Past, it tells practically the same archetypal story of a youth rising up to the challenge of finding the people capable of helping him to seal the ultimate evil. The difference being that Ocarina of Time tells its story much better than A Link to the Past, which essentially had just the skeletal structure in place and little substance to fill it with. Ocarina of Time, on the other hand, has charismatic personalities, memorable moments, and character arcs. And what's most important, it really knows how to properly set things up. Which A Link to the Past also did, but thanks to all the improvements it is even more impressive in Ocarina of Time. The game begins with an ominous dream showing an encounter between Child Link and the main villain Ganondorf chasing after little Zelda. This is an immediate hook. How did it come to this, and what will happen next? Well, we shall find out if we play. The game then immediately establishes that Link is special among the other Kokiri in the forest because he is the only one without a fairy. Not only does this set up a future sort of predictable twist that Link is not a Kokiri at all, but also it contextualizes the fact that even in this beginning section, Link needs progression blockers. And getting ostracized for being different is certainly one, which later on is the fact that it's going to have a character resolution of its own. In fact, when you think about it, Ocarina of Time is one of the better examples why this category is called context and not narrative. Because the plot is more about masterfully contextualizing the player's actions rather than telling a particular story. After all, if you think about it, it's really a game where you have to go around the world to complete 9, remember not 7 but 9, different dungeons. And why would you do that? Well, the game tells why, and the reason is not just in the MacGuffins that you need to collect, be they living or artificial. In one case you need to save Gorons from starvation, in another to save a princess. And while the goal in all the adult Link dungeons is similar, you need to awaken the sages and get them into a chamber within the Sacred Realm so they would fulfill their destiny, here the game bets on your connection with the characters you meet throughout the adventures. One of the sages is Saria, your friend from Kokiri Forest. Another is Darunia, who calls Link his sworn brother. Every sage is somebody you meet as Child Link, even Naboru, the person you meet last and know the least, but still build enough of a connection to feel sad that they have to sacrifice themselves and leave this world to save it. And what's important is that the game ensures there is at least one memorable moment related to each of the sages. Saria gave us our first ocarina, which we had to play on for Darunia to get him out of his depression. get the drift. And even the side character cast is memorable as well. We've got the vengeful farmhand, the weird mask seller, the monster-looking deadbeat. Many of these characters have little bits of progression throughout the story, some are fairly sad. Ocarina of Time can be light on some details, sure, but it weaves a pretty strong world fabric. I really appreciate that it tries to be original too. For all intents and purposes, the Goron and the Zora serve the roles of dwarves and elves in the usual fantasy stories, but they clearly are not dwarves and elves. King Zora is especially an elf-like. I appreciate that even though Link and Zelda know from the get-go who the main villain is, their hasty plan to defeat Ganondorf fails. They got too far into the fantasy of playing heroes to save the world, lacking certain maturity required to deal with such a threat, and only after 7 years passed they actually become heroes. And it feels particularly harrowing to see that the once bustling Hyrule town has transformed into ruins full of re-deads, and in some ways that's because of you. But then again, the consequences of your actions are also felt throughout. You are the one who will save Gorons from their predicament in the Fire Temple. Thanks to you, the ice thaws in Zora's domain. You get a family and their farm back. And you get to see the consequences of your actions. You get to see previously empty cities get back to life again, the same life you saw there as a child. Ocarina of Time has certainly a lot going for its implementation of what would otherwise be a pretty standard heroic tale. That said, it is not without flaws. Like with design, there is a bunch of problems, ranging from some small and inconsequential unanswered questions like who the hell is this owl, to some really big issues like the handling of Zelda's character at the end. I don't want to spoil things in case you happen to not have played the game yet, but let's just say that Ocarina of Time sets Zelda up as somebody who is going to grow to have lots of agency that is suddenly and unjustifiably taken away, so we could still have a goal of saving her from Ganon. Really disappointing. You might have also noticed that I didn't really discuss anything related to the game's namesake, the Ocarina of Time. Well, that's because it really is not important, not even as a MacGuffin. We'll discuss its undeniable importance to the overall cohesive nature of the game later, but in terms of story and context, the instrument is entirely cuttable. And that's just not something one would watch for the subtitle of the entire game, right? As such, should you open up all the scores for context, I will assign an 8. Ocarina of Time doesn't tell anything new, but we don't rate if a game tells a new story or not, we rate how well it contextualizes everything. And Ocarina of Time has an interesting world, great characters, nice pacing, a lot of big and little setups and resolutions. It might have some pretty severe flaws, but as a whole it is still a very well-crafted tale about growing up and becoming a hero. Now let's discuss aesthetics. This is another category with the weight of 1, as it's again about something that enhances the experience but does not define it, this time through visual style, sounds, music, etc. Ocarina of Time is one of those games where music is literally transformative. Take a look at this, the starting location in Kokiri Forest. There is already a lot of life to it, magical dust in the air, the Kokiri doing their thing alongside their fairies. It looks like a place from a childhood dream. But then add music to it and... the sum of it just elevates everything beyond, doesn't it? This can apply to pretty much literally every location. Hyrule Field already looks atmospheric enough with its wide plains and Hyrule landmarks in the distance, but listen to it with music and... The castle town is already full of life and colorful characters, each doing their own thing. But put in the sound treatment and... Kakariko Village? The Temple of Time. Even dungeons, the music of which is much more ambient in nature, which makes sense considering that you will spend much more time in these locations in comparison to other places, so one wouldn't want the soundscape to start feeling repetitive quickly. A special mention should definitely go to the Ocarina songs. They're incredibly catchy, and that's saying a lot considering that their leitmotifs are based on 3 notes that you have to use in gameplay. Some people might say that some sound effects like Link's grunts or Navi's "Hey listen" might be annoying. But honestly, neither bothered me. All this is why, should open up the scores for aesthetics, I will assign a 10. Ocarina of Time's visual and musical design manages to create a sense of space, culture and history, and that's one of the highest compliments one could give to a game's aesthetics. It's time to tackle Cohesion. This category has a weight of 2, and it's all about how well a game connects all of its different aspects together to create a singular, wholesome experience. What I love about Ocarina of Time is that music is not just used to enhance the game aesthetically, but it is a connective tissue of the entire experience. This might sound weird considering how inconsistent its usage is for the game's design and how little it matters for the narrative, but the instrument is an absolute treasure when it comes to connecting every facet of the game together. If you look at it mechanically, the ocarina is just a way to do magical actions through a combination of buttons. It could be literally anything, even something as traditional as a magic wand, with the button presses being its motions. But by making this object an ocarina, an instrument that can play music, Legend of Zelda transforms leitmotifs into gameplay mechanics. Leitmotif is the concept of a recurrent musical theme that is strongly associated with an object, person, action, or idea. The Legend of Zelda series itself utilizes leitmotifs a lot. This was the overworld leitmotif that appeared in the very first game, and not only it represents the adventure spirit of exploration, but it also became the main theme of the whole franchise. And this was Ganon's theme that we hear whenever we see him on screen or are in a location closely related to him. That is the classical use of leitmotifs. They play whenever something associated with it appears or happens in front of our eyes. In Ocarina of Time, however, this technique is not used as frequently because through our instrument we are actually the ones calling upon the leitmotifs, thus solidifying them in our minds. As an example, let's take Epona's song. This music plays in exactly one place, the Lon Lon Ranch. Not much for a leitmotif, right? However, we learned how to play that tune on our ocarina. Later we would play that song to calm Epona down so we could mount and save her. And after that, whenever we need to call upon her help, we play that very same song every time. So even though the music on its own appears in just a single place, by playing it ourselves, we are the ones creating the connection between the song and what it represents. Ocarina of Time also uses this technique for world building. For example, you learn Zelda's lullaby very early in the game. That song is related to the royal lineage, and can be used to, let's say, open a tomb of the royal family members. But you also need to play it within the different temples you will go to, and just like that, without any words or lore, just through music, you know there is a link between these places and the rulers of Hyrule. Another interesting thing in Ocarina of Time is that characters can actually play their own themes within the world. Remember Ganon's theme? Well, in his castle you can hear a very dark pipe organ version of it as background music, and in the end it turns out that Ganondorf himself was playing it. All this forms a very intricate relationship between the game's music, the world, and the players, by not just associating leitmotifs with certain locations or people, but also the characters themselves playing them within the context of the universe, and the players invoking many of the musical tunes to progress and achieve certain actions. A very strong emotional bond is formed through music. This makes Ocarina of Time truly special from a cohesion standpoint. But that's not the only thing that makes everything feel wholesome. There's all the points I have mentioned in other categories, like how the game masterfully contextualizes the actions that we're doing in the game, which obviously is a cohesive element between gameplay and narrative. Another aspect is how growth, which is a pretty important theme of the narrative, is represented within the gameplay growth. While it is done through character stats, with the exception of hearts, they're not represented numerically, so you get to feel them. Like how when you're Child Link it takes more hits for you to defeat certain enemies than when you're Adult Link. It is a simple weapon damage stat change, but you feel like you have become more experienced. The 3DS version of the game adds some pretty interesting details, like Impa's house having a lot of drawings that are actually hints, solutions to different puzzles and obstacles you will encounter throughout the game. It is a very nice nod to Impa's experience and how she was planning to transfer that knowledge to others. In the end, should you open up all the scores for Cohesion, I will assign a 10. In The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, not only are the different facets of the game connected together really well, through music and how it is used, the game really elevates the experience on an emotional level. Which is a good segue into the last category, emotions. This is the most subjective part of Stasocritic, as it's all about personal feelings. But since personal feelings matter a lot and can trample any flow of a game, it has the second biggest weight, 3. Ocarina of Time was the second Legend of Zelda game I have ever played. The first one was Breath of the Wild. And mind you, to me there is a difference between trying something out for a bit and properly playing it. And the Legend of Zelda series is something I have never properly played as a child or a teenager, at most dabbled with emulators for a bit. Maybe due to me never previously owning any Nintendo device outside of the DS, as at the time it was really difficult to get Nintendo consoles in Eastern Europe, but the point is, you could hardly call me a Zelda fan. So, Breath of the Wild was the game that really got me into Zelda, and after it I decided to check out all other games in the franchise, starting with Ocarina of Time. At first I tried the Nintendo 64 version, and probably surprising nobody given the content of this review, I dropped it after reaching the Water Temple because I felt like I didn't have the time to figure that monstrosity out. Putting iron boots on and off was incredibly annoying. And then, after I heard about all the 3DS version improvements, I decided to give that a try, and that was the version of the game I actually have properly finished. My first reaction was that, while certainly enjoyable, it's probably a game of its time, which is why I didn't have any strong emotional response to the experience, especially after playing Breath of the Wild. But as days have passed, I noticed something interesting. I've been humming Saria's song, which is not an unusual thing. I hum a lot of game music that I like. But this was just the beginning. Because Ocarina of Time is intricately connected to music, I couldn't hum Saria's song without thinking about how Darunia danced to the tune, or about the moment when she accepts her destiny as a sage. And this kind of chain has continued towards many aspects of Ocarina of Time, leading up to things like the last shot of Zelda and Link looking at each other before the end of the game, or more gameplay related things like being terrified of re-deads. A couple days have passed and all I could think about was a bunch of nice moments from the game. There is a sort of timeless element to Ocarina of Time, and the music is a very big part of that. When it comes to design, having a different song for every teleport location is not great. When it comes to the narrative, Sheik barely plays a role in it. But every time Link and Sheik play a song together, it feels special, like there is actually a budding relationship developing between them. So the game focusing on music that much was a pretty genius move, not just from a cohesion perspective, but emotional one as well, because it's easy to connect memories to music, especially when you're the one playing it, like in Ocarina of Time. You are the one creating the connection between leitmotifs and their subjects, which naturally ascends into the feeling of building an emotional connection with all the different characters and actions that happen in the game. I definitely understand how Ocarina of Time has managed to achieve such an everlasting legacy. I may have made fun of how the game's top spot at the Metacritic chain feels undeserved due to the ridiculously written reviews that have put it there, and I have criticized quite a lot of its design aspects, but in the end, what really makes it revolutionary is not its design, it's the amazing staying power. And it exists because of how very smartly Ocarina of Time is built as an overall experience. Basically everything that we have discussed in the previous several sections. So should we open up all the scores for emotions, I will assign a 10. It was originally released in 1998, and even though I played it for the first time 20 years later in 2018, it still stayed with me. It all started with the music, but not every game where I like the music has managed to carve quite a lot of spots within my memory. Definitely helps that the nature of this tale being one about growing up is pretty timeless. Let's sum everything up. After all weights and their scores are taken into account, the final Stasocritic rating of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is 86. This is indeed a great classic that deserves to be played. It's not as tightly designed a game as A Link to the Past, that's for sure, but even with that in mind, Ocarina of Time has managed to become not just an engaging game, but a transformative experience. And this is why it had such a huge cultural impact. It should also be commended for making a successful transition from 2D to 3D on their first try. Not every franchise has managed to do that, some still try. But honestly, I think that a lot of discussions that aim to defend Ocarina of Time as a perfectly designed game do a disservice to it. You know, there are plenty of people who might start talking about how maybe Ocarina of Time is overrated or has aged badly, and this usually gets a reaction in the vein of, oh, you have to understand that at the time this was great and no other games have done anything like this, and so on. But to me, both sides are missing the point. Ocarina of Time has popularized Z-targeting and a number of other smaller mechanics that since have become a standard in so many games, sure, but novelty aside, design as a whole has never been its strength. And that's okay, because its atmosphere was. The feelings that it caused, the emotions that it helped to stir inside you, the immersive experience that it has provided. That's what makes Ocarina of Time a classic that deserves to be played. Not trying to find the reason why a boring mask side quest is actually good content, or how Dampa's heart-pounding grave-digging tour is a good way to find a piece of heart. It's not. A Link to the Past's heart-digging may not have been something amazing, but due to its fast pace and the fact that you were the one doing the digging, it was infinitely more enjoyable than waiting forever to get Dampa to a particular position and test your luck. This might feel like a weird example to compare, but my ultimate point is that it's absolutely fine to accept Ocarina of Time's game design as flawed and even underwhelming, because that's not the beauty of this game. What makes Ocarina of Time so great, so timeless that many people still fondly remember and play and replay it to this day, what has actually made so many people fall in love with this game back in 1998, is the fact that it's greater than the sum of its parts. It is an experience to remember.